All right, last week we went over what you need to do for the project, the design part of the project. Your project's done in two parts, and again, there's two assignments out on Canvas. And the first one, you're going to come up with something that 4 parts of it are going to be written. They're going to be in a Word document, all right, or PDF or whatever document type that you prepare, but it's going to be written. And the 5th part of it, the prototype, will be actually HTML and CSS. And think of it as a rough draft of your project, where we identify the people that are going to be using your site, the goals that they have, the goals that you as the maker of the site has, what specific pieces of content you're going to put on the site, how you're going to organize it, then how you're going to lay it out. That's in a nutshell, that's everything we talked about in last week's lecture. Were there any questions on that? Okay, another assignment that you have sort of running throughout the semester is a portfolio. And people make portfolios for a lot of different reasons. Specifically, web developers make portfolios to showcase their skills. All right. And that's sort of what we're going to do here, but portfolios can also be used in education to help you see and summarize what you've learned. So let's look up a web developer's portfolio. Let's see if we can find an example of one. Well, let's look at this one. Oh, top 10. All right, let's look over here. All right, it identifies a person, tells a little bit about their attitude, I guess, their philosophy, their statement about their work. And then it has samples of their recent work. And you should be able to link to it. Oh, or this is a mobile app, so maybe you can't link to it. But there's screen images for it. Let's look at this one. Oh, this is not a mobile app. My mistake. She's showing you what it looks like on a desktop or on a laptop as well as on a mobile site, which we're going to talk about in this class because that's a very important thing as far as websites go. And then you can actually go to the site itself to see what it looks like. Now, your portfolio is not going to look maybe as flashy as this, but yours is going to do a similar thing. It's going to have a list of, it's going to have a little bit of information about you. You don't have to write a book, all right, but a little bit of information about you. And on the homepage, then it will have a link to the various assignments that you've created and a statement about what you think you learned during that assignment and maybe what you would do differently on that assignment. Just your thoughts and reflections on the assignment. So we're doing a portfolio more for educational purposes to sort of help you gather your thoughts about what we've covered so far in this class. But with a few changes, it could easily be made as a portfolio to market yourself. So I made a little sample of one, and I want to show that now and talk about it for a few minutes. All right, I only did this for 2 labs. Notice how I have my portfolio in a folder, and I have each individual lab in a folder. So lab 1, lab 2, and then I have index.html, which is my portfolio's homepage. So I double click on that, and I'll say, oh, I want to open up in Chrome. And boy, this is really simple. All right. Mike Zelder's portfolio, you'd have a paragraph about yourself, and examples. This tag I learned you have to put ending tags. And I didn't put a reflection for this one, but you should. And then finally, I have my footer that says that. So far, nothing that fancy. But when we click on these links, we go to what you submitted for Lab 1. Notice I have a link back to the portfolio. So you'll have to make a slight change to your lab assignments to include a link. My suggestion would be is put it on the very top left of the page. Just put it the very first thing. That way it makes it real easy for me when I'm grading. Lab 2, portfolio home. All right, so that's a kind of idea of what I want. One page that sort of talks about you a little bit, talks about each assignment a little bit, a links to the assignment, and then a link back to the portfolio's homepage. Now, this is one thing that we're going to be a little different than any of the other examples we've seen this year, because all these portfolio files are not in the same directory. Okay, notice we have portfolio file. The index is in the portfolio directory, but Lab 1 and Lab 2 are in their own Lab 1 and Lab 2 folders. So you have to go from this folder down to the Lab 1 or down Lab 2 folder. And then from this folder, you have to go back up to the parent folder. Now, there's a pretty standard way of referring to that. And if any of you have taken CISS216, you probably use the double dot notation to indicate going up and the folder name to indicate going down. So if I'm in this folder and I want to display something in this folder, what I do is I put the name of the folder at the beginning and then a slash. And I have faq.html. This one's in Lab 2, so I put the name of the folder slash faq.html. So to go down a folder, to go from the parent folder to one of the folders underneath it, you put the name of the folder, a slash, and whatever. Now notice there's not a slash at the beginning. And notice also there's not the C:\\/ file whatever that some of you have tried, some of you have done on some of your assignments. The reason for that is that will only work on your machine, and you don't want to do that. This is what's called a relative address. In other words, based on the position of this index file, where is this file? And you don't specify the exact location. You just say, well, go down a directory, and there it is. All right. If it was 2 subdirectories deep, you would put the 2 directories and then the file name. All right. Now remember, this only applies when you're talking about files that are in different directories. So now Lab 1 has its own folder. And if we edit that, to get back up to the index of the portfolio, you use .. /index. All right. That takes you up to the parent folder. You don't have to put the name of the parent folder because a folder can only have one folder above it, right? Only one parent folder. So you don't have to say that this is called portfolios or whatever. You just say .. to go from the Lab 1 folder up to the previous folder. Now remember, this only applies when you're talking about files that are in 2 different directories. For example, in this case, this assignment has a CSS file. I don't have to refer to that file as anything but style.css because the file and the CSS are in the same folder. You only use these folder names and the dot dot when you're going from one folder to another folder. All right, the other thing that you can do is if you have images and you want to put all your images in a separate folder, you could create an images folder and then on your page say images / the name of the image. Or you could put all your style sheets in a folder. And where you wanted to point to a style sheet, you could say style / the name of the style sheet file. This is one of those things that is probably easier to experiment with than to explain. I mean, this is a basic explanation of it, but play around with it. Take an assignment and put all of your images in one folder and the style sheets in a different file and see if you can point to them. All right. And if there's any trouble, of course, I can help you out with it. Do keep in mind that when you're done, you have to zip up the folder that contains everything. So if I was turning this in as my assignment, I would go up to the parent and I would create a zip file, wherever that is, send to zip file. I'd create a zip file from that portfolio folder because that's the folder that contains everything. The Lab 1 folder, the Lab 2 folder, and the main portfolio folder. All right, does that make sense? All right, play around with that. Your first draft of the portfolio is coming up fairly soon, if I'm not mistaken. I mean, within a few weeks. It shouldn't be a lot of work. You should only have to do 2 things, really. Number 1 is create a portfolio homepage. That's a little bit of work. Then you have to create links to your lab assignments and from your lab assignments back to the portfolio page. That shouldn't be much work at all. That should be a lot of copying and pasting. All right. So you'll say link dot dot, you make your link dot dot / index.html. You'll copy that on the top of every page and you should be good to go. As always, you can show me what you've done in lab if you're not sure if it's right, or you can email it to me and I can check it out and make sure you're going in the right direction. All right. So our next discussion is going to be about how to make the web page laid out the way that we want to. And this section is heavily in CSS. We're not going to really talk about any new HTML tags. I don't think so. But we're going to talk a lot about CSS because CSS is what achieves the layout on the page. All right. So far, all of our layouts have pretty much looked the same, right? They've looked like maybe this page where you have a string of things going down the line, or if you styled it, something like this. All right. But you notice you have one section after another. Here's your header section, here's the nav section, here is some content, here's some more content, there's my footer. They're like building blocks stacked on top of each other, and each of those blocks takes up the full width of the screen, okay? And if I change the width of the window, the page adjusts itself to fit in the width of the screen, which is kind of cool. Now, in our discussion of web design, we talked about wireframes. Now, in a wireframe, we may decide that, pick a simple one here. Yeah, let's pick this one. That we want a banner going across the top of the screen, but we want 2 columns. Maybe a column here with links or other stories. And then we have our main content here. That's a different layout than what we've done before. These are not blocks stacked on top of each other. All right. So therefore, we can't just get by doing what we've done so far. There's a thing with there's a concept in CSS called the block model. And what that does is that treats every section of the page sort of like a block. And you can decide almost anything about the block, like how wide it's going to be, how much space there is from this block to the next block. All right, that's the second thing you can decide. How much space there is before the text starts inside the block, if there's a border around the block or not, and finally, what the position of the block is. So we'll be seeing that block model in action in all the examples that we're going to do. Now, keep in mind, we're going to be on this for a few weeks because this is a really important concept and there's a lot of different ways you can do them. All right. I would say that no one way is always the best way. That it's good to know a variety of ways to lay out the page. Then depending on the specific page that you're talking about and the specific needs of your design, you use one of these techniques or the other. There are some that are probably most of the time preferred, and we'll talk about them and why they are preferred most of the time. But we'll talk about several different ways to lay out your page. So let's look at the first example. I have one web page that's laid out 6 different ways. This would be an example of your prototype. So let's say you're in that point of the project when you have created your wireframes, you've done the other 4 steps. Now you want to build a prototype. Well, you need to take that wireframe and bring it to life. All right. So that's where these prototypes come in. This is where you're taking that wireframe and making HTML and CSS code that implements that wireframe. Now, here's the nice thing about CSS. If someone decides they want a layout to be different, all you should need to change is the CSS. You don't have to change any of the individual web pages. All your CSS should be in one file, and if you change that, it should change all your pages. So here's the first example of a layout. I started out, by the way, to sort of let you know the process. I started out with a template. All right. So here's a template where I developed a vacation guide. All right. Zeller's Guide to Vacation Destinations. Home, Hawaii, Iceland, Brazil, Australia, Italy, single travelers, family. Then I have my content. Then I have some special content like this. And then I have my footer at the bottom. Okay, fair enough. Now, I'm going to create the template that contains all the stuff that's common on every page. So, is this header going to be common on every page? Yes. So, my template's going to contain the header. Is the navigation going to be the same on every page? Yes. All right. At least in this example, it's going to be identical on every single page. Is the footer going to be the same on every page? Yes. Is the specific content going to be the same? No. The page about Iceland is going to have different content than the page about Brazil. But they will share the same header, they will share the same navigation, and they will share the same footer. So when I'm developing my template, I'm developing a web page that's sort of a shell for all the other web pages I'm going to create. Then what I do, I get this right, I develop the HTML and CSS for it, and then I clone that page. So I copy this page and make my home page. Copy this page and make my Iceland page. Copy this page and make my Hawaii page. All right. In other words, developing 10 web pages doesn't take 10 times as long as developing one web page. All right. You develop the one template, then you only change on each individual page the part of it that's different, which is, a certain percentage of the page. So let's look at this template. The template goes along with the style CSS and also this background image. The template is going to be pretty much the kind of HTML that we have seen from the beginning of the course. Got my doc type, head section. We'll ignore these two links for now. All right, we'll come back to them. The body has a header, the body has a navigation, there's a section and a footer. I mean, this is probably the second or third day of class we covered this. All right, the HTML. What really makes this different, what really elevates this page from being just a very simple, plain, dreary, drab page to making it a little more lively is the CSS. So what I'm going to do is I'm temporarily going to rename the CSS file. So I'm going to break the CSS. So I'll call it Z style. When I refresh the web page, that is what the page looks like. And again, the text is a little bit bigger because I made the text bigger. Zoom in to make it easier to read. But you can see this looks like any of the labs that we've done, you know, the first couple of labs that we did. It's the CSS, though, that, again, makes it livelier. So I'll rename it back. And now it's back looking like this. Okay. All right, so let's look at the CSS that does this. And there's really a lot of CSS going on in here, but not that much. All right. This is actually achieved with very little CSS, maybe less than you would expect. And we'll take a look at it. Notice, first of all, that we have these blocks, header, nav, section, and footer. And we have those blocks in the CSS version. They just look different than they looked in the plain version. Okay? But we still have those 4 blocks. We've just changed some of the attributes of those 4 blocks. All right? And notice that they're stacked on top of each other. That is sort of the natural way for a web page to be laid out. Unless we specify otherwise, a web page is going to be laid out in what's called the flow. In other words, the first block, the second block underneath that, third block underneath that, and so on down the line. All right, let's look at the CSS. And we'll take it a step at a time. All right, first of all, under body, I have background image, URL, background tile.png. That's an image file that's in my same folder. All right. In other words, that background tile PNG is in the same folder as that. So therefore, I only need to specify the name of the file to make it the background image. So you use this syntax to make a background image. If we look at this file, it's just a tiny little square. But it's tiled. In other words, they're laid side by side and top and bottom in both directions. So they form sort of like a complete picture. It's just like if you bought floor tile or wallpaper, you'd line it up so that the seams matched the image of each other. The same thing here. You can't really see where one tile ends and another begins if you look at the background image. Now, the text on this background image might be hard to read. So therefore, we made the white the other backgrounds for the rest of the blocks. Oh, what is this? Okay, I think we're okay now. All right. So, background image that, font family, Helvetica, Arial, Sans Serif. Remember, we specified multiple fonts because each individual machine may or may not have a particular font. Windows machines typically do not have Helvetica, but Windows machines do have Arial, which is like a clone of Helvetica. So a Mac has Helvetica installed, so it would use Helvetica. A Windows machine doesn't have Helvetica, so it would use Arial. Finally, if there was a machine somewhere that didn't have either of those two fonts, maybe some mutant Linux machine or something, it would use the last one, sans serif. So the browser goes down the line until it finds a font that that machine has. And it starts at the beginning and goes to the end of the list. So I define the font for the whole page. All right. Now, you might say, well, this doesn't look like it is Helvetica or Arial or sans serif. Well, I must have defined a different style rule that overrides it. Remember, if you define a style rule on the body and define a different style rule on the H1, the H1's style rule will win if you're styling two different attributes, because that's a more specific definition, all right? The closer to the content that you define the style rule, that's going to apply over stuff that's further away. All right. So let's look at the next thing, header. This is where we're getting into the box model. The most important things of the box model are the following. The first four. Margin. The margin is the space between this and other elements on the page. Okay? And the margin, again, like these other properties, works like a clock. The first number represents the top margin. The second number represents the right margin. The third number represents the bottom margin, and the fourth represents the left margin. I think you have to flip that because I'm pointing. So top, right, bottom, left to make it match the way that you're directed. This is a shorthand property. In other words, I could specify margin bottom, margin top, margin left, margin right, but I would just as soon write the margin one time. All right, margin, colon, 0 auto. So 0 means 0, means there is no space between things vertically on this page. So there is a 0 for the top margin, 0 for the bottom margin. So as far as vertically go, these things are right on top of each other. And if we look at the page, we see that is the case. All right? No space between these two things, no space between these two things, all the way down the line. If I were to change that to 10, let's say, whoa, what did I change? All right, notice that there's a little bit of a gap because I made the top and bottom margin 10 pixels, so there's 10 pixels between these two things. Now, one small thing about margins that you must understand is called margin collapsing. If I put a 10 bottom margin on this guy and a 10 top margin on this guy, you might think that there's going to be 20 pixels between those two. There's not. There's going to be 10 pixels. All the margin does is make sure there's at least that much space. So 10 and 10, yeah, both of them satisfy. If it's 10 pixels apart, that satisfies the rule for both the top and bottom margin. That's what you get. Similarly, if you made 25 and 10, it would make 25 spaces between them because the 10, well, that's at least covered within the 25. All right. Auto means effectively automatically set the margin, and it will do that and center the item. So auto means make it such that there's equal to the right or left and to the right. Now notice this continues if I make the page smaller. It's always centered until I reach a certain width where the data is cut off. So if I say auto margin, it will put it right now. It will put it in the center between the right and left. What if I change something about the margin? Let's change this to 0 pixels and 100 pixels. Then it's 100 pixels from that side and 0 pixels on the top. So that might look centered if my screen was a certain width. But if I resize the window, it's no longer centered because I said 100 pixels. I made it a specific number. And that will only be centered for a certain width of the screen. In general, it's better not to use specific numbers of pixels. And we'll talk about that later on in more detail. And we'll probably talk about it a little bit now in this example. But it's best not to use specific number of pixels just for reasons like that. The other thing I want to emphasize is it's important to look at your web page a couple different ways. All right? Let me set this back to what it should be. If I have a web page, I might look at it in the Chrome browser and say, that looks good. Well, there's other browsers. In theory, each browser should show the web page. If you followed all the rules, it should show the web pages identically. In practice, that's not always the case. So therefore, I would test this in Firefox. That looks good. And I would test it in, well, this is Internet Explorer. I thought they would have Edge on here, but it doesn't matter. Even on that old dinosaur Internet Explorer, it looks okay. The other thing I would do is I would test it for different screen widths. So in other words, get back to Chrome. I would make the screen wider and narrower and make sure it still looks good. A lot of students turn in designs that I can almost tell how big their monitor is, how big their screen is, because it works perfect at a certain layout, but if I view it in a smaller window, it doesn't look good at all. Stuff overlaps each other and so on. So test it by making your window narrower. We will also at some point be concerned about what the page looks like in a mobile device. And you can emulate that in Google Chrome by going to More Tools, Developers Tools, and you can pick, all right, where did it go? normally is an option up here. What am I missing? Oh, this. This one? Okay. Yeah, I'm used to seeing it this way. You can go and you can pick and say, I want to see what it looks like on a Samsung, whatever that says, SB. And it looks like that. All right. So you can actually emulate on a Surface Pro. It looks like that. You can emulate how it's going to look like on a mobile device to make sure it looks at least reasonable on that. So it's important to view these pages because as a web developer, you have no control over how your page is being viewed. You don't know what browser someone is using. You don't know what hardware. You don't know what sort of device they're using. And therefore, your goal is to make it workable in all those modes. Does it need to be identical in all those modes? Not necessarily. All right. And we'll talk about ways to make your page look different on a mobile device versus a desktop device. Okay. So that is the margin. The border is what is around the block. And this is sort of a shorthand technique. There's actually three attributes: border style, border color, and border width. All right. I can combine them into one that says border period, because solid has to be the width or the style, black has to be the color, and 2 pixels has to be the width. So I think another example is dotted. Really hard to see, but these are actually, this became a series of dots going around it. We might make it obvious by making the dots bigger. This is probably going to be hideous. Yeah, I don't really like that. So we'll go back to what it was. I encourage you to play with this. Go to W3 Schools and see a list of all the attributes, or find another site that shows you the list of possible values and attributes, and play around with it. What if I make this wider? What if I make it narrower? And so on. The radius is the amount of curvature on, save it, is the amount of curvature on the border. All right. So there's a radius there. If I make that number smaller, it's going to look more like sort of a rounded rectangle. It's going to look more rectangle-ish. You can't really see unless you look close, but there's actually a little curve in there because I made it very small. Let's make it 15. There's a little more rounded. If I omit it altogether, it makes it just a rectangle. Now, here's a good thing about CSS. You can get away with some mistakes in CSS. Like, let's say I didn't know what the property was supposed to say, and I just make something up. If it doesn't know what you mean, some things it can ignore. All right. If it doesn't know, if you don't have the correct value for an attribute, it'll just ignore it. Now, other things will break it and cause it to have an error. Like, for example, if I forgot that semicolon there. That's something where it can't figure out what I meant. And it sort of breaks it. But it breaks it at the point that the problem occurred. So notice it is round. All right. But it broke it. Oh, it made it 600. It can't tell these two things, but the rest of it figures out. So the browser is very resilient, at least with HTML and CSS. It gives it its best shot at figuring out what you mean if you violate one of the rules. Okay, padding. Padding is a space from the edge of the box to where the text begins. Now, this is going to be a little hard to see with the text centered because that sort of does its own thing. Let's make the text left aligned. There's 15 pixels between the edge of the item and where the text starts. If I make that number bigger, oh, that's too big. If I make it bigger, there is bigger space. And again, it goes in all four directions. And I could put padding left, padding top, padding right, padding bottom. Or if I don't specify that, it goes in a clock. In this case, I have the same number for each one. So all four of those dimensions will get the same setting. It's kind of hard to see when you center it. So I'll leave it at 15. That will put 15 on the top. All right, we're back to normal here. All right. Text align center, that puts the text in the middle of the box. Background color white. We made the background color white so that we could see the text on top of the white instead of on top of the background image. If we omitted this, there's no background, therefore it would get the background of the body tag. I guess that doesn't look too bad, but I'm going to make it white anyhow. All right, H1. Notice H1, I mentioned before, why wasn't H1 Helvetica, Arial, and sans serif? Well, because there is a style rule. And I define the style as Garamond, comma, serif. So if it has Garamond, it will use it. If it doesn't, it will use the generic serif font on this browser. Because the H1 overrules what was defined on the body. The H1 tag is closer to the actual content than the body is. Therefore, it's a more specific way of referring to it, and therefore it applies. Of course, if it wasn't there, it would use the default that was defined on the body level. All right. Now, by the way, my other four sections, the nav, the section, and the footer, I pretty much have the same style rule as. I actually could have done it by saying footer, nav, and separate by commas, but I generally don't like to do that. I'd rather specify each one individually, so therefore I can change them independently. So I made all of these have the same style rules, and therefore that's why these things line up so neatly. All right, we won't be able to get through all of this, but I do want to cover a couple more things. Nav UL. What that means is any UL within the nav section. Notice I have in this example two ULs. I have the UL within the nav section, and I have the UL within the section. This style rule only applies to the UL in the nav section. Remember, this is called a selector, and it allows us to point to the specific thing on the page that we want to change. So here we're defining not every UL, just the ULs within the nav section. We want to have a list style type of none. And that might be a little hard to remember. That essentially means there's no dots in this bulleted list. No dots at all. Display of inline on the LI means that it's not a block tag, so it will not stack side by side. It'll stack, or not stack on top of each other, it will stack side to side. That's why despite these being LIs, each one is not on its own line, because I made LIs have a display of inline instead of a display of block. Remember, your browser has defaults. By default, your browser displays LIs as block tags, but you can override that. You can override anything. By default, the browser makes your links blue with an underline. You can override that. By default, your browser makes the H1 a certain size, the H2 a certain size, and so on. You can override that. So what we're doing is we're overriding this to make it inline. And we're putting a left margin on it. All right? Therefore, there's space between them to the left side of it, at least. If we made that number bigger, they'd be spaced wider apart. The other thing we did is we made we'll cover the link next time. All right, I don't want to get into that now. So there's really just a couple more things in this layout. This layout is taking longer than the rest of them will because we're introducing some brand new concepts. In the other layouts, we'll just be using some of these concepts and adding a few more. So take a look at this. Play with this. You know, say, what if I change this number to that number, and see if the screen looks like the way you expected it to look. All right. And even these, even though we're covering a lot of attributes here, these are only some of the attributes you can specify in CSS. Pretty much anything that has to do with the display of content, you can change via the CSS. The browser has its defaults, but the CSS will override those. Okay, are there any questions? All right, we'll see you over in lab.